Watch that one first and then come back to this one. So we're going to start right where Callie left off, and just like Callie was using in her video, I will also be using the British Library's English Timelines pilot project, and somewhere either at the end of this video if I can figure out how, or in an email or somewhere, I will post the actual URL for this website so you can go through and look at the manuscripts and images in more detail if you like later, because I will just be flying through this. So we're going to start at the little eye icon right here that says Language Change 100 Years War. In the last video you learned a lot about how the Middle English period was a time of a lot of transition, and transition largely in language and culture. And another key point in that transition is the 100 Years War. If you recall, William the Conqueror came in 1066 and he invaded from Normandy, which is in France. So when he became king, he established French, the French language, and French culture and everything as the reigning language of the land. And it continued that way until the 100 Years War, because in the 100 Years War, the British were fighting the French for control of the French throne, and they were at war for over 100 years. And during that time, because they were fighting the French were now viewed as the enemy, and so speaking French was no longer looked on as something favorable, and instead people started speaking English. And at this point in time, it was Middle English that was being used. It's not Anglo-Saxon, it's not our modern English, it's kind of a blend between the two, somewhere in between. So the 100 Years War, just a little bit of background, started in 1337. The English king thought that he had a claim to the French throne because England still had some holdings in France. The French king obviously said no way, and so they fought about it for over 100 years. It ended in, I believe, 1453, so that's about 115, 116 years. But it was not one consecutive 100-year some battle, it was a series of conflicts, and so there'd be a couple of conflicts and then a huge battle, and then it would die out for a little bit, and then they'd fight again, and then it'd die out for a little bit. So that took a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of money, and a lot of people died, so that was a fruitless conflict in the midst of this Dark Ages period in English history. And another reason why it's called the Dark Ages, we're moving on to the Black Death right now, is because of the Black Death, not black. It was called the Black Death because when victims would get bit by the disease, which was transmitted by fleas, they would have little black bumps that would break out all over their neck and their throat and their arms, and then they would die shortly thereafter. So 1348 is the date that the Black Death reaches England. The Black Death is also known as the bubonic plague or the Black Plague, and here we have an image of a recording of the Black Death in England, and if it loads I'll be able to show it to you. But the Black Death came to England. It was one of the last countries that it reached, and it was a very, very bad epidemic because there's not a lot of sanitation, is not very good, and so during this time, mostly in the 1300s and 1400s, between 30 to 50% of the population was wiped out. And the plague continued in different waves until the mid-1600s, but the 13 and 1400s were the worst part. And when you have up to half of the population dying, think about that. There's going to be labor shortages, there's going to be a whole bunch of problems in terms of continuing with generations, and because of that, that's one of the main reasons why this time period is called the Dark Ages in English history and European history in general, because people were so focused on trying to survive and have enough food to eat and making sure they had all the labor that they needed to get things done, that they weren't putting a lot of time and effort into arts and cultural flourishing and such. So that's why it's called, one of the reasons why it's called the Dark Ages. Now we're going to move on to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is the first book that we will be reading in the Middle English period. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a poem written by a person only known as the Pearl Poet, off of another one of his famous poems. He is an unknown author, so we don't know much about him. There's a couple speculations as to who he might be, but nothing confirmed, so I don't have time to go into all the theories. But this is an image of one of the early manuscripts, and this is a scene from the beginning when the Green Knight visits the court of King Arthur. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the earliest recorded Arthur stories, and like Beowulf, it is part of the Cotton Manuscript Collection. And as you're reading through Gawain and the Green Knight, you'll notice that it is written in a style very similar to Beowulf, although it's written a long time after, but the author of Sir Gawain the Green Knight was intentionally trying to be archaic and harken back to the old times of the Anglo-Saxon England, and so he was not writing in the style that was typical for Middle English at that time. He was writing in an older style, although, and his dialect reflects the older dialect and the older way of saying things, so take note of that as you're reading, and you will see more about this scene when you read. This is one of my favorite parts in the book. And then we're going to move on from Gawain all the way to Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales, I'm sure some of you have probably read it before, was written by Geoffrey Chaucer, who is called the father of English literature because of this work. And it was written somewhere between 1387 and 1400, but Chaucer is called the father of English literature because Canterbury Tales is the first recorded work, the first widely read work in Middle English. And this, like the Hundred Years' War, is another key point on the timeline of language change because so many people read Canterbury Tales, and that helped establish Middle English, cement its authority as the language of England. And unlike Beowulf, you don't have to study a language before you can read the original. So Canterbury Tales is written in Middle English, and you can pick up the original and read it without having to study it, although it will be difficult, but you can do it. And I'll zoom in on the manuscript, if my computer will let me. There we go. And you can see recognized words. Whoop. Okay. So you can recognize words. There's the word Canterbury, the word holy. If I could zoom in closer, my computer's not letting me. If I could zoom in closer, we'd be able to pick out specific words, but that is Canterbury Tales. And it also is a good portrait of life in the Middle English period because it chronicles the story of a pilgrimage of people from all walks of life and all professions. And it was really popular and a lot of people read it. And also, like Canterbury Tales, another important event in the evolution of English as the language of England was Wycliffe's English Bible. So England was still part of the Catholic Church at this time, so all the services and books and everything were in Latin. But John Wycliffe wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible in their own language. So he illegally translated the Bible into English and distributed it. And if this page will load, I will show you a page of the original Bible. So this is Wycliffe's Bible. And this, like Canterbury Tales, further cemented the use of English as the language of England because it was in English and people could read it and it was very widespread. And then 1415, you'll see at the top, just a brief note there, that was a great English victory in the Hundred Years' War. King Henry V won against great odds, and the English are very proud of this victory. But ultimately, the French did not win the Hundred Years' War. And moving on all the way to 1450, we have the Western printing press invented. I'm sure you've heard of Gutenberg and his Bible and how the printing press is super important. The printing press was invented in 1455, and then it reached England in 1476. A man named William Caxton brought it over, and the very first book he printed was Canterbury Tales, so that the advent of the printing press also reinforced English because now books were being printed in English and everyone was getting their hands on them, and it was just a lot more accessible. So that is another key event. And our final event that leads us all the way to the Renaissance is the War of the Roses. There's not an icon about this, so I'm just going to talk about it. But the War of the Roses was a contest for the throne of England between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and it spanned the 1460s, 1470s, and 1480s, and both the House of York and the House of Lancaster descended from an earlier house in English history, so they were trying to claim the throne, and it was a time of a lot of strife in England because even though there would be kings that would sit on the throne for a good amount of time, their reigns were very tenuous and they kept having to guard their throne and make sure it was secure, so there wasn't a lot of security in England at this time. And then in 1485, Henry Tudor, who was kind of an underlord for the House of Lancaster, came on the scene. He defeated Richard III, the same Richard III from Shakespeare's play, who was from the House of York, and then he established himself as king, married a York woman from the House of York, and so he presented himself as a blend between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and established himself and became Henry VII. And 1485 is the date to remember that the Tudor dynasty begins, kicks in the Renaissance, and that the Middle English period ends. So that is a brief overview of the Middle English period. Make sure you take the quiz. There's a little Jeopardy game that we prepared to help you study for the quiz, but it's optional. So enjoy, and we'll see you next week.